The medieval village did not wake gradually. It woke the way all agricultural communities have always woken, all at once, driven by the unforgiving logic of winter daylight. In England in January, the sun rises around 8 in the morning and sets around 4 in the afternoon. That gives you 8 hours of usable light. Not a minute of it can be wasted, which means that the preparation for the day must happen before the light arrives. The peasant farmer, let us call him William, because William was one of the most common names in medieval England after the conquest, is awake in the dark. His house is a single room, or perhaps 2, if he is moderately prosperous. A low-ceilinged space, perhaps 20 feet long and 15 feet wide, timber-framed, its walls filled with a mixture of clay and straw and dung called daub. Its roof a thick thatch that is one of the better insulators available to a man of his station. The floor is packed earth. The single hearth is a central fire pit or a simple stone fireplace against one wall. There is no chimney in the poorer houses. The smoke finds its way out through the thatch or a hole in the roof, staining everything it touches on the way the fire has been banked overnight. William kneels beside it and coaxes it back. The same motion, the same breath, the same hope that the coals have held through the cold, and in minutes the room is lit and fractionally warmer. His wife Agnes is already moving. She is, by the customs of their world, the keeper of the indoor economy, the fire, the food, the children, the dairy work, the garden in summer. William's domain is the fields. The division is not absolute. In the crunch times of harvest and lambing, everyone does everything, but in winter it reasserts itself. She is heating water. He is pulling on his outer clothes. The children are still asleep, piled together in the warmth near the hearth. They will stay asleep until they are needed. Outside, the village is beginning its own slow waking. Smoke from neighboring chimneys, the sound of a door, a dog barking at something in the dark, then stopping. We need to stop here and look carefully at this room, because everything we think we know about medieval peasant housing is probably wrong in one direction or another. It was not a hovel. It was not a ruin. It was a purpose-built structure, constructed by people who understood their climate and their materials intimately. A well-maintained peasant house in 1300 was warm. Not by our standards, but genuinely warm relative to the outside world. The thick thatch was an excellent insulator. The daub walls, when in good repair, kept out the wind. The single room meant that body heat, from the family and often from animals sheltered at one end, concentrated rather than dispersed. It was also not spacious. In a house of 20 by 15 feet, a family of 5 or 6 ate, slept, worked, argued, loved, grieved, and spent essentially every non-working hour of their lives. Privacy in the modern sense did not exist. The concept barely had a word. The furniture was minimal, a trestle table, boards on supports that could be taken down to create sleeping space, 1 or 2 stools, a wooden chest that served as storage, seat, and sometimes bed. Wooden bowls and spoons, a few clay pots, iron hooks over the fire for the cooking pot, rushes on the floor, changed when they became intolerable. On the walls, not bare. This is the part that surprises people. Medieval peasants decorated their homes, painted patterns on the plaster where the walls were plastered, a small devotional image, a carved wooden Christ, a painted saint near the door or above the hearth, a sprig of dried herb or a bundle of dried flowers. The desire to make a place feel like home does not require wealth. It requires only the human instinct that has always been there. Near the door, pegs hold the family's outer clothing, wool cloaks, a spare pair of leather shoes stuffed with straw to hold their shape, a hat. These are not luxuries, they are equipment, as essential as tools, and maintained accordingly. The room smells of wood smoke and the particular warm animal smell of people and occasionally livestock sharing close space. It smells of last night's pottage and this morning's fire. It smells of home. Breakfast in a medieval peasant household was not a meal in the full sense. It was fuel. The main meal of the day came at midday, dinner. The substantial meal eaten when the work of the morning was done and the light was at its height. Breakfast was whatever was available and quick. A heel of yesterday's bread, a cup of ale, perhaps some leftover pottage heated directly in its pot. Not glamorous, not intended to be. The bread deserves a moment. It was the foundation of the medieval peasant diet. Not the soft white bread of modern imagination, but a dense, dark loaf made from whatever grain the household had. Wheat produced the finest bread, but wheat was expensive, and much of it went to the Lord's table or to market. Peasants more commonly ate bread made from rye, barley, or a mixture of grains called maslin. It was heavy, slightly sour from the natural leaven used to raise it, and extremely filling. A working man might eat 2 pounds of bread in a day. The ale is equally important to understand. Medieval people did not drink water as their primary beverage, not because they were unaware of its existence, but because they had learned through generations of hard experience that certain water made you sick. Ale, brewed from malted grain, water, and sometimes herbs, was safer, provided calories, and was drunk by everyone, including children, in a form much weaker than modern beer. Agnes brews it herself, as most village women did, in batches that last a week or two before going off. The children are awake now, drawn to the fire by the smell of the heating pottage. The youngest sits directly in front of the hearth, close enough that his mother occasionally pulls him back. The older ones eat standing, already knowing they'll be needed outside before long. William eats quickly without sitting. He has a long day ahead, and the light is already deciding whether to arrive. before we can understand a single day in this village, we need to understand the system that organized its entire existence. The open field system, the agricultural framework of most of medieval northern Europe, was one of the most sophisticated collective enterprises in human history, and also one of the most invisible to the people living inside it, because it was simply the way things were. The village's agricultural land was divided into 2 or 3 great open fields, large enough to take a full day to walk across, which were in turn divided into long, narrow strips. Each household in the village held a number of strips scattered across these fields, mixed in with their neighbors' strips in a deliberate pattern that distributed good and bad land fairly across all households. No single farmer held all his land in one place. Everyone's strips were interleaved with everyone else's. In a 2-field system, one field was planted with winter grain, wheat or rye, sown in autumn to overwinter and be harvested the following summer, while the other lay fallow, recovering its fertility through rest and the grazing of animals on the stubble. In a 3-field system, one field held winter grain, one held spring crops like peas and oats and barley, and one lay fallow. The fields rotated each year in a cycle that the village had followed for generations. This system required coordination on a scale that is easy to underestimate. Plowing, sowing, and harvesting had to happen across the entire open field collectively, because one farmer's strip was surrounded by his neighbor's strips with no dividing fences. The village operated as a single agricultural organism, its members bound together not just by proximity, but by the literal necessity of working in concert. In winter, the fields are empty. The winter grain is in the ground, a thin green blush of shoots barely visible under the frost. The fallow field is white. The village animals graze on the stubble where the harvest was taken. William looks at his strips from the field's edge and reads them the way you might read a face, checking for signs of frost heave, of waterlogging, of the particular shade of green that means the grain is healthy versus the particular shade that means it is not. What he sees this morning is acceptable, not good, acceptable. He will take it. There is a persistent myth that medieval peasants had nothing to do in winter. The myth comes from a misunderstanding of the agricultural calendar. Yes, the major field operations, ploughing, sowing, haymaking, harvest, were concentrated in spring, summer, and autumn. But the fields did not stop requiring attention in winter, and the farm infrastructure required constant maintenance year-round. In a village in January, the work never stopped. It just changed. The drainage ditches that ran between the strips and around the field boundaries had to be cleared. In a wet English winter, standing water in the fields could damage the overwintering grain or make the soil unworkable come spring. This was cold, miserable work. Kneeling in mud and ice to scoop out the accumulated silt and debris with a wooden spade or a mattock, your hands going numb within minutes, the ditch water seeping through whatever you were wearing. Fences and hedges needed repair. The field boundaries, low earthworks, wooden posts, hawthorn hedges, were the physical expression of property rights, and damaged boundaries meant disputes. A gap in the hedge around the common field could let animals in to eat the winter grain, which could mean the difference between the village eating next August or not. Threshing continued through winter. The grain harvested in summer had been stored in the barn, and now it was threshed, beaten with wooden flails to separate the grain from the stalk, in batches throughout the cold months. This was exhausting work, done inside the barn where it was marginally warmer. The rhythmic crack of the flails filling the air with chaff that got into your eyes and your lungs and your hair. And always firewood. Wood that needed collecting, splitting, stacking. In a village where every household depended on fire for warmth and cooking, the woodpile was not optional. William works. His breath makes clouds. His hands are already cracked from the cold. He does not complain. There is no one to complain to. The church was not one institution among several in the medieval village. It was the institution, the axis around which the entire community turned. Consider what the parish church provided that had no secular equivalent. It kept the calendar. The liturgical year structured time itself, marking the rhythm of fast and feast, labor and rest. Advent, Christmas, Plough Monday in January when the agricultural year officially restarted, Lent, Easter, the great summer saints' days, Harvest Festival, All Souls. Without the church calendar, winter was just cold. With it, winter had a shape, a series of events, a theological meaning. The church was the only public building in most English villages, the only stone building too in most cases, its permanence and solidity a deliberate contrast to the timber and thatch of everything around it. When something needed to happen collectively, a meeting, a legal proceeding, the collection of dues, the reading of a royal proclamation, it happened at the church. The porch, the nave, the churchyard, all public spaces used for purposes that had nothing to do with religion in the narrow sense. The priest is a man named Thomas. He is not educated by our standards, Latin for the liturgy, some basic theology, the rudiments of canon law, but he is probably the most literate person in the village, the one who can read the documents the Lord's steward presents and who writes the occasional letter for a villager who needs one. He occupies an ambiguous social position, above the peasants by education and holy orders, dependent on them for his tithe income, bound to them by the fact that he was probably born among them. Mass this morning is the same as every morning. The Latin words move through the cold stone interior and return as echo. The congregation, those who came, and not all do on a weekday, stand in the nave, which has no seating. They are not expected to follow the service closely. They are expected to be present, to bow at the elevation of the host, to pray in their own words, in the gaps between the priest's words. Then it is over. They return to their work. The bell does not care whether they understood. It rang. That was enough. We need to talk about the thing that shaped everything else in William's life, that we have not yet named directly. William is a villain, a serf. He is not a free man. This word, villain, has drifted in English to mean simply a villain, a bad person, which is a linguistic trace of the contempt medieval society officially directed at its own labouring majority. In its original sense, it meant a person bound to the land of a lord, owing labour services and payments that were not negotiable and not optional. What did this mean in practice? It meant that William owed the lord a certain number of days of labour on the lord's own land, the domain, each week, usually 2 or 3 days in normal times, and more during harvest. These were days he worked for the Lord rather than for himself and his family. Days his own strips went unattended. The timing of these labour services was controlled by the Lord's reeve, the village official who managed the estate on the Lord's behalf and could be called in at any time. It meant paying fees, a heriot when the head of the household died, typically the family's best animal, a merche when a daughter married, permission to give her to another man's household, a tallage, an arbitrary tax levied at the Lord's discretion. Every significant life event had a fee attached. It meant that William could not leave, could not move to a town, could not take up a trade elsewhere, could not remove himself from the village without the Lord's permission. He was, in the most literal sense, the Lord's property in perpetuity. And yet, the actual lived experience of serfdom was more complicated than this legal framework suggests. Many villains in practice had considerable independence. They farmed their strips, managed their households, participated in the village court, built networks of obligation and mutual aid with their neighbours. The Lord's demands were real and sometimes crushing, but they were also predictable. You knew what you owed. You planned around it. This is not an apology for serfdom. It was an injustice, maintained by violence and custom and the weight of a social order that called itself divinely ordained. But the people living inside it were not crushed into passivity. They adapted. They pushed back when they could. They found dignity in the margins the system left them. William pays what he owes. He resents it without saying so. He gets back to work. Down the lane, beside the stream that has been running slower and darker in the winter cold, the mill is working. The Lord's mill was one of the most contested spaces in the medieval village, and understanding why tells you a great deal about how power operated at the ground level of medieval life. Every household in the village was required, by law, by custom, by the physical impossibility of any alternative, to bring their grain to the Lord's mill to be ground. They could not grind it themselves. The Lord held the monopoly on milling as one of his manorial rights. For this service, the miller took a portion of the grain, typically 1/16 of the total, though the actual amount was a constant source of dispute as his payment and as the Lord's revenue. The miller therefore occupied a peculiar position in village society. He was simultaneously one of the most essential people in the village. Without him, nobody ate, and one of the most distrusted. The opportunity for fraud was obvious. You brought your sack of grain, you got back flour. The miller controlled what happened in between. Short measures were endemic. The fingers on the scale were proverbial. Chaucer, writing at the end of the 14th century, would make his miller a cheat as a matter of literary convention, because every reader would have found this unremarkable. The actual miller in this village, call him Robert, is not necessarily dishonest. He may be perfectly fair. But the structural suspicion attached to his role means that his neighbors watch him carefully, compare their yields, discuss his practices in the low voices of people who cannot afford to make formal complaints against someone they depend on. He grinds their grain. They resent his power and his portion. He knows this and accepts it as the condition of his life. The wheel turns. The millstone turns. The flour accumulates in the wooden bin below. While William is at the fields and Robert is at the mill, Agnes is running an economy. This is not a metaphor. The domestic labor of medieval peasant women was not merely supportive of the household's survival, it was constitutive of it. Without what Agnes did every day, the household did not function, and what she did every day was extraordinary in its range and skill. The dairy work was hers. In winter, with the cows producing less, this was reduced but not eliminated. Milk, what there was of it, was processed into butter and cheese rather than drunk fresh, because butter and cheese kept, and keeping was everything in a world without refrigeration. The butter churn was worked by hand, the motion repeated for as long as it took, which could be an hour or more. Cheese was pressed in wooden molds and set to age on a shelf. Both were partly for the household and partly tradable commodities. A woman with surplus butter or cheese had something to bring to market. The brewing was hers. Ale was made in batches, the malted grain boiled with water and sometimes flavored with a mixture of bitter herbs called groot. Hops would not become standard in English brewing for another century or more. The process took several days from grain to drinkable ale and required judgment at each stage. A failed batch meant the household drank water, which nobody wanted. The textile work was hers. Spinning, the drop spindle turning in her hand while she walked, talked, watched the children, was constant. Medieval women spun continuously in any free moment because thread was always needed and never enough. When there was enough thread, it was woven. When there was enough cloth, it was cut and sewn. Every garment the family wore was made in this room, by these hands. The garden was hers. In summer, the kitchen work was hers. The children were hers. The nursing of the sick was hers. Agnes worked from before dawn to after dark. So did every woman in the village. The historical record barely mentions them. They were the foundation everyone else stood on. Once a month, or sometimes more often, the village holds its court. The manorial court, the hallmote, was one of the most important institutions in peasant life, and one of the least examined by historians who focus on the grand sweep of medieval history. It was where the actual texture of village life was managed, recorded and disputed. The court was held in the Lord's name, presided over by his steward or bailiff, but its business was largely conducted by the villagers themselves through a jury of 12 men drawn from the village, men who knew everyone and everything that had happened, and who applied the customs of the manor with a practical knowledge that no outside judge could have matched. The business of the court was relentlessly specific. John the carpenter has let his pigs into the common field, damaging the winter grain of 3 neighbours. He is fined. Agnes, the widow at the edge of the village, has failed to maintain the ditch on the eastern boundary of her holding. She is fined and ordered to repair it before the next court session. Walter has been caught selling ale that failed the assize, the official standard of quality and measure, for the 3rd time. His fine is larger this time. There are also larger matters. The transfer of land when a tenant dies or surrenders his holding. Disputes over boundaries that could turn violent if not formally resolved. The occasional criminal matter. A theft. A fight. Those serious crimes went to the king's court rather than the manorial one. What strikes a modern observer about these records, and the records survive, in astonishing detail, in archives across England, is how active and capable these supposedly powerless peasants were in the management of their own affairs. They knew the customs, they cited precedent, they argued their cases with clarity and persistence. They were not passive objects of lordly power, but active participants in a legal system that, within its limits, offered them real recourse. William is on the jury this session. He listens carefully to the case of a boundary dispute between 2 neighbours whose strips have been generating ill feeling for 3 years. He has his own opinion. He keeps it to himself until the jury retires to deliberate. The verdict, when it comes, is practical and locally sensible, and will be ignored by one of the parties within 6 months. The court is adjourned. The midday meal, dinner, was the meal that mattered. This is the moment the household gathered. The fire was built up, and Agnes brought to the table everything she had been preparing since morning. It was not a feast. It was, by modern standards, simple and repetitive. But within those constraints, it was real cooking, produced with skill and knowledge and care. The pottage was the center of the medieval peasant diet, and pottage was not one thing but 1,000 things, depending on the season, the stores, and what the kitchen garden had yielded. At its most basic, it was grain or legumes boiled with water and salt. Barley pottage, peas pottage, the latter being the origin of the nursery rhyme that was, for most of the Middle Ages, a straightforward description of dinner. In richer versions, it included onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, dried herbs. When there was meat, and in winter, fresh meat was rare, salted or smoked meat less so. It went into the pot and transformed everything. The church's fasting regulations shaped the diet powerfully. On the roughly 150 fast days scattered through the medieval year, Fridays, Wednesdays in some traditions, the entirety of Lent and Advent, meat was prohibited. This meant that the knowledge of how to make a satisfying and nutritious meal without meat was not a dietary specialty, but a basic survival skill. Fish was the principal substitute, dried, salted, smoked, as preserved as possible, because fresh fish was available to few villages far from the coast or a significant river. The family sits, William at the head of the table, Agnes beside him, the children in order of age. They say grace, a brief habitual prayer, the words worn smooth with use. They eat, they talk, or they don't. The children squabble over the bread. Agnes settles it without looking up from her bowl. Outside, the winter afternoon is already deciding to become evening. At the edge of the village, closest to the common, the forge is working. The blacksmith was one of the most essential and most respected craftsmen in a medieval village, occupying a social position several rungs above the average peasant. His skills were not easily learned and not easily replaced. He was the only person in the village who could make and repair the iron tools that the entire agricultural operation depended on. Plowshares, harrow tines, axe heads, hoe blades, scythes, the iron fittings of carts and barn doors, and the hinges of the church. In winter, the forge was one of the warmest places in the village, and its warmth was real. A proper forge fire, burning charcoal at temperatures high enough to make iron workable, generated serious heat, and the building that housed it was saturated with it. People found reasons to linger near the smith's workshop in January. The smith himself, a large man necessarily, given the physical demands of his work, with forearms built by years of hammer work, was currently repairing a broken plowshare that would be needed when spring ploughing began in February or March. The iron had to be heated to the correct color, bright orange, not yellow-white, which was too hot, then hammered on the anvil while it held that heat, the work done in a matter of minutes before the metal cooled and had to be reheated. He had learned this from his father, who had learned it from his father. The knowledge was physical and embodied, in the eye that read the color of the iron, in the arm that knew how hard to strike and at what angle, in the ear that heard whether the hammer blow had landed right. Around him, the tools of the village hung in various states of repair. A broken axle fitting, several hoe heads needing new handles, a chain that had snapped at a weak link. He would get to all of them. He always did. The children of the medieval village were not children in the modern sense of the word. This is not to say they were not loved, or that their parents were indifferent to their well-being. The evidence from wills, from coroner's inquests, from the occasional personal detail that survives in records, all of it suggests that medieval parents loved their children with the same intensity and the same grief that parents have always felt. The high child mortality of the medieval world did not produce detachment. It produced a different kind of care, more urgent and more religious, because the mechanisms of loss were so much closer. But childhood as a protected period of play and development, a time set apart from adult responsibility, was not available to the children of the medieval peasantry. A child of 7 or 8 was expected to contribute to the household economy in real and significant ways. The youngest children minded the animals, or rather they stood near the animals and screamed if anything went wrong, which was their primary function and which they performed with variable success. Slightly older children gathered firewood, carried water, ran errands between households, minded younger siblings. By 10 or 11, a boy was working in the fields alongside his father. A girl of the same age was doing adult domestic work alongside her mother. William and Agnes's eldest, a boy of 12 called Thomas, named for the saint whose feast day fell near his birth, was in the field this afternoon helping clear the drainage ditch. His hands were red with cold and he had lost the feeling in his toes an hour ago, but he worked with his father's same wordless steadiness, learning the landscape of the work the way he was learning everything, by doing it beside the person who had done it before him. The youngest, barely 3, was tied to a post near the house with a length of rope, which sounds cruel and was in fact a safety measure. Medieval villages were full of hazards that a toddler would not survive unsupervised. She did not appreciate the rope. At the edge of the village, where the houses thin out and the common land begins, there is a cottage smaller than the others. Margaret has lived alone here for 4 years, since her husband died of a fever the winter before last and left her with a half yardland, about 15 acres of strips in the open field, and 3 children, the oldest of whom was 9. She has managed it. This is not a small achievement. A medieval widow operating a farm holding without a husband was swimming against the current of every social and economic assumption her world made. The labor services owed to the Lord did not stop because the man who owed them was dead. The strips needed ploughing and sowing and harvesting. The tithe needed paying. The manorial court expected to see someone from this holding appear when summoned. Margaret hired labor when she could afford it. She relied on the network of mutual obligation that ran through the village, the understanding that she would help others when she could in exchange for help when she needed it. She worked her strips herself when she had no choice, which was often. She appeared in the manorial court records 3 times in the past 4 years. Once to have her tenancy formally confirmed after her husband's death, once to dispute a boundary incursion by a neighbor who had evidently decided she could be pushed, and once to report a theft of 3 hens, which the court eventually resolved in her favor. She also brewed ale commercially, one of the few occupations reliably available to women that could generate independent income. She appeared regularly in the court rolls fined for ale infractions, which sounds like punishment, but was, for commercial brewers, functionally a licensing fee. You brewed, you were fined, you paid, you continued. Tonight, she will sit by her fire after the children are asleep and do the accounting that she alone can now do. The accounting of whether they will make it through the winter on what is left in the stores. The numbers are close. They are always close. She has made it through close before. At the center of the village, in a house not much larger than the others, but with a bush hung above the door, the traditional sign that ale was for sale. The tavern is open. Not a tavern in the full modern sense. There was no permanent licensed premises in most English medieval villages, no dedicated building given over to drinking. What existed was the alewife, almost always a woman because brewing was domestic work extended into commerce, who sold ale from her house when she had a batch ready, signalling its availability with the ale stake and bush above the door. This evening, Joan the alewife has a fresh batch ready, and the news has travelled through the village the way news always travels in small communities, entirely without formal communication, within the hour. A dozen people have found reasons to call in. The alehouse was one of the few spaces in medieval village life where the normal rules of hierarchy relaxed, where the work stopped, where people sat together without a specific purpose. This made it, in the eyes of the church and the Lord's administration alike, a space of mild suspicion, a place where gossip was exchanged, where resentments could be aired, where the occasional spark could catch and smoulder into something more serious. The church preached against excessive drinking with some regularity. The manorial court occasionally fined people for disorder that started at the alehouse, and yet neither institution managed to suppress it, because the alehouse was serving a need that neither the church nor the Lord's hall could serve. The need to simply be together, warm, with a cup in your hand, saying whatever came to mind. Tonight, the conversation moves through the village's concerns with the casual efficiency of people who have talked to each other every day for years. The cold, the state of the drainage ditches, the miller's short measure last Tuesday. Everyone has noticed. Nobody has formally complained. The information circulates anyway. A new baby in one household. A cow that has been off her feed for a week. William is here. He does not drink much. Ale costs, and the family's stores are carefully managed. But he is here. Because a man who never came to the alehouse was a man setting himself apart from his community. And that was not a comfortable position in a world where community was the only safety net available. He sits with his neighbors. He says little. He is warm. For an hour, the winter is outside rather than in. Father Thomas is eating his supper alone. The priest's house, the parsonage, was typically one of the better houses in the village. Stone built in some cases, larger than average, with a small garden attached that was his by right of his living. He received the tithe, the legal tenth of every household's agricultural produce, which in theory made him reasonably comfortable, but in practice depended on the village's own prosperity and on how diligently he enforced collection, which created its own tensions. He had been ordained young, sent to a bishop's school where he learned enough Latin to perform the Mass, and then appointed to this living by the Lord who held the advowson, the right to appoint the priest, a right treated as property, bought and sold and inherited like any other. Father Thomas had not chosen this village. He had been given it. He had been here for 11 years. His religious life was not what a modern observer might expect. The medieval parish priest was not a theologian or a spiritual director in any sophisticated sense. He performed the sacraments, baptism, mass, last rites, administered the penitential system at Easter, visited the sick, buried the dead, and preached the occasional sermon in English that summarized the theological content his parishioners needed to know. He also knew things. In a community where literacy was rare, the priest was the person who read the documents, who knew what the law said, who could write the letter and read the reply. This knowledge was power, and Father Thomas used it as all power is used, sometimes generously, sometimes in ways that served his interests. He was not a bad man. He was a human one, capable of charity and of pettiness, of genuine pastoral care, and of the small manipulations available to anyone in a position of authority over people who cannot easily refuse them. He finishes his supper. He says, "Compline," the night prayer, alone in the cold church. He goes back to the parsonage and gets into bed. He says a prayer for the village. He means it. In the house at the north end of the village, old Edmund has been sick for a week. This is not an unusual event in the medieval winter. Cold, damp, crowded living conditions, a diet that by January was declining in variety and nutritional richness. All of these made winter the season when illness visited most frequently and most seriously. The elderly and the very young were most vulnerable. The working-age adults who survived childhood had built up resistances that gave them some protection, but no immunity from the fevers and chest illnesses that circulated through close communities. Edmund's wife is managing him with the tools available to her, which were not nothing. Medieval folk medicine was a sophisticated body of practical knowledge, most of it held by women, transmitted orally, accumulated over generations of observation. Some of it worked in ways that were not understood until modern times. Elderflower and elderberry for fever and immune support. Garlic, which has real antimicrobial properties. Honey on wounds. Willow bark for pain and fever. Some of it did not work, but did no harm. The comfort of someone attending to you, of warmth and broth and familiar voices, was itself therapeutic in ways that medieval people understood intuitively without the vocabulary of modern medicine. The difficult cases went to the priest first, for prayer and last rites if necessary. A physician was available in towns, but not in villages. The expense was prohibitive, and the distance too great for anyone seriously ill. The village healer, usually a woman with a reputation for medical knowledge, was the practical alternative. Her remedies a mixture of herbal medicine, prayer, and the accumulated wisdom of a community that had been dealing with illness for as long as it had existed. Edmund is old, and this is a serious illness. His wife knows this. She sits beside him and changes the cloth on his forehead and speaks to him quietly about things that happened a long time ago. The summer they met. The year the harvest was so good, they ate well all winter. The children when they were small. He listens. His eyes are open. Outside, the village has gone quiet. It is the 2nd of February, Candlemas. The feast of the purification of the Virgin, 40 days after Christmas, midwinter by the old reckoning, the moment when the liturgical calendar announced, somewhat ahead of the evidence, that the darkness was retreating. The name came from the candles. Every household brought candles to the church to be blessed, and the Mass was celebrated by their light. The small flames of the village multiplied into something that filled the dark nave with warmth. For the peasant farmer, Candlemas had a meaning beyond the theological. It was a threshold. The days were genuinely, measurably longer now than they had been at the solstice. The fields were still frozen, the stores still being rationed, the work still hard. But something had turned. Plough Monday was behind them. The spring ploughing was perhaps 6 weeks away. The agricultural proverbs attached to Candlemas were precise and practical. If the weather was fine on Candlemas, there was more winter to come. If it was overcast, the worst was behind. Whether this prediction system worked is debatable. That people used it speaks to the intensity with which they read any available sign of what the coming months held. The village came to the church this morning with their candles. The light inside was extraordinary, more light than this building normally held. The flames reflected in the painted walls, the brass of the cross, the eyes of the congregation. Father Thomas performed the blessing with more ceremony than the average weekday Mass. Even he felt it, the change in the air, the slight collective loosening of breath that came when winter began to seem finite again. Afterwards, in the churchyard, people stood longer than usual, talked. Some of the children ran. Agnes walked home with a blessed candle in her hand, its flame shielded against the cold wind. She would keep it all year, lit only in need, at a difficult birth, at a deathbed, in any moment when the ordinary protections seemed insufficient and something more was called for. She did not think of this as superstition. She thought of it as sense. Beyond the open fields, at the edge of the village's agricultural land, lay the common. The common was not wasted land. It was one of the most economically important resources in the village, and it was shared, genuinely shared, governed by rules that every villager understood and mostly respected, enforced by the same manorial court that handled everything else. In winter, the common was where the village animals grazed, the cattle, the sheep, the pigs, the geese, all the livestock that could not be fed entirely from the household's stored hay and straw were turned onto the common to find what they could in the frost-dried grass and scrub. The right to graze a certain number of animals on the common, one's stints they were called, was attached to each holding in the village and was fiercely guarded. A man who grazed more animals than his stints allowed was taking from his neighbours as surely as if he had reached into their stores. The common also provided fuel, dead wood, cut from the common's trees and hedgerows under rules that specified how much each household could take and what types of wood could be cut. Peat, where it was available, rushes and sedge for thatching and floor covering. The common was in effect the village's shared infrastructure, the supplement that kept individual households viable when their own resources were not quite enough. This shared resource created constant low-level tension, boundary disputes, arguments about overstocking, accusations of cutting green wood that was not permitted. These disputes ran through the manorial court records like a thread. The same arguments, the same families, the same patches of ground, year after year, generation after generation. But the common also created something else, a shared stake in the management of shared resources that was genuinely collective. The village, in governing its common, was governing itself. The court that managed these disputes was made up of the same people who had the disputes. They were, in the most literal sense, their own government, limited, imperfect, frequently self-interested, but real. William is driving his 2 pigs across the common in the late afternoon. They root in the frozen ground with a focused energy that he finds, despite everything, briefly funny. He watches them for a moment before turning back toward the village. The bell rings vespers. In the medieval village, the canonical hours were not observed with monastic precision. The villagers were not monks, and the demands of agricultural labor did not bend to the liturgical clock. But the principal offices, matins at dawn, mass in the morning, vespers at dusk, compline at night, were marked by the bell, and the bell was heard by everyone. Vespers, the evening prayer, was the signal that the working day was officially over. Not that the work stopped immediately. There was always something to finish, always one more task that the dying light made urgent. But the bell named the transition, gave it a frame, said, "This is the boundary between the day's labor and the evening's rest." People moved toward home. The fields emptied. The sounds of the village changed. The open-air sounds of outdoor work giving way to the closer, warmer sounds of households drawing inward. Doors closing. Fires being built up. Children called in from wherever they had been. In the church, Father Thomas rang the bell himself, then stood in the open doorway for a moment, watching the village settle. He could see, from this slight elevation, most of the houses, their chimneys beginning to smoke more heavily as the evening fires were built, the pale columns rising into a sky that had gone from grey to deep blue while he watched. He said his own evening prayers briefly, alone in the dark nave, and then went to eat his supper. The last light left the western sky. Stars appeared. The medieval village at night was not the world as reason described it. It was the world as imagination had always populated it. Official Christianity, the theology of the church, as taught by educated clergy, drew a clear line between the supernatural realm of God, angels, and saints on one side, and demonic or diabolical forces on the other. This was the authorized map of the invisible world, and it was detailed and precise. But alongside this authorized map, the village maintained its own, older, less systematic, more locally specific. The spirits that inhabited particular trees, particular springs, particular crossroads. The practices, leaving bread on the doorstep, speaking certain words over a sick animal, not spinning on certain feast days. That had nothing to do with official theology and everything to do with the accumulated folk wisdom of communities trying to manage an uncertain world. The church called this superstition. It called the old women who knew the old remedies witches, with a seriousness that would become lethal in later centuries, but was still building in this period. It preached against the old ways, against offerings at springs, against the night fires of midsummer, against the 100 small practices that continued in the gaps between Sunday sermons. And the village listened and agreed and continued anyway. Not out of defiance exactly, out of the pragmatic religious sensibility of people who needed all the help they could get. If praying to Saint Margaret for a safe childbirth was right, and if also leaving a piece of bread on the doorstep for the household spirit was something your grandmother had always done, and your children never got sick, then you did both, God and the old ways, the church and the spring, faith layered on faith. This was not simple ignorance. It was the complex religious life of people whose experience of the world's uncertainty had made them disinclined to put all their eggs in any single theological basket. William comes back from the common in full dark, feeling his way down the familiar lane by memory. He does not think about what might be in the dark beside the lane. He thinks about it a little. He walks a bit faster. The evening in a medieval peasant household was not restful in the sense of being idle, but it was a different kind of work. Indoor work, crafts and repairs and maintenance done by firelight, while the family talked or sat in the comfortable silence of people who had been together all day and had run out of the need to speak. William was mending a leather harness strap that had cracked in the cold. Leather work was one of the basic domestic skills a man needed. A broken strap replaced by a cobbler cost money. A broken strap repaired at home by firelight cost only time and the knowledge of how to do it. He worked with an awl and a long needle threaded with waxed linen, the stitch tight and regular. Agnes was spinning. She had been spinning in every free moment since morning. The spindle was in her hand when she thought about it, and out of her hand only when something more immediately demanding appeared. The thread grew by inches. The children were closer to sleep than to waking, the youngest already gone, the middle one telling a half-coherent story to the dog that had pushed its way into the house and now lay in the warmest spot available with the sublime confidence of an animal that had correctly identified where it needed to be. The fire talked in its low voice. On the shelf above the hearth, the small carved figure of a saint looked down at the room from its place between a bundle of dried rosemary and a horseshoe hung for luck. Which saint? Agnes knew. She had been given it by her mother. Whether it was entirely approved by Father Thomas, was a question she had never asked, the horseshoe she would defend to anyone. Every winter morning, at some point, Agnes counted, not formally, not with numbers written down. She could not write, but she knew what was in the stores with a precision that was the product of necessity and long practice. The grain in the sack, the salted pork in the barrel, the cheese on the shelf, the dried peas, the ale, which would last another week, the honey used sparingly for illness and never otherwise. January was the real test. The harvest felt distant. Spring felt distant. What was left had to last until the garden started producing again in April, until the animals began giving more milk, until the world turned back toward plenty. The distance between here and there was measured in what was on those shelves, and the measurement was taken every day. Medieval famines were real, not an ancient or theoretical danger, but a recurrent feature of life. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was a generation ahead of this particular winter, but its predecessors and its echoes were everywhere in the memory of the village. A harvest failed by frost, by floods, by drought, by the blight that turned grain black in the field, and the stores that seemed adequate became inadequate, and then absent, and people died. Most winters were not famine years. Most winters were just winters, cold and long and hungry in the way that a mild hunger becomes normal when it is constant enough. The diet narrowed in January and February. The bread was darker and harder. The pottage was thinner. The ale was weaker. Agnes looked at what was left. It would be close. It was always close in February, but she had seen it be this close before, and she had gotten them through. She would get them through again. She closed the chest and went back to the fire. The village was going to sleep. One by one, across the cluster of houses, the lights were going out. The shuttered windows that had glowed amber went dark. The sounds of evening, a distant voice, a dog, the occasional creak of a door, were replaced by the deep winter silence of a place where there was nothing left to do until morning. In William and Agnes's house, the sequence was the same as every night. The children were settled, the youngest already in her wool-wrapped sleep. The older ones talked down from wakefulness with the particular firmness of parents who needed them unconscious. The fire was banked. This mattered. The fire was the household's most critical asset after the stores, and losing it to carelessness in the night, to a stray spark catching the rushes, or to the coals dying completely in the deepest cold, was a serious problem. Agnes covered the coals with ash in the careful way she had done since she was old enough to be trusted with it. They would hold until morning. The door was barred. The shutters were latched. The small space was sealed against the night. William and Agnes lay down together under their wool covering on the pallet that was their bed, in the warmth the fire had built during the evening. The warmth would not last until morning. By the time they woke, The house would be cold again, and the routine would begin again. But now, for these hours, it was warm. He thought about the stores briefly, then stopped. She thought about Edmund, whether he was any better. She said a prayer for him, not in Latin, just the words that came, addressed to the Virgin in the familiar way of people who feel they have some sort of relationship with her after years of asking. Outside, the wind moved across the common field and the frozen village and found no one awake to notice. The stars were out, every one of them. The village is asleep. The fires are banked. The winter night is doing what it does, pressing its cold weight against the thatch and the daub and the wooden shutters, looking for the gaps, finding them. In the morning, William will rise before dawn and begin again. The same field, the same ditch, the same strips, the same tools, the same cold. Agnes will coax the fire back from the coals. The children will eat their porridge and be sent to their work. The bell will ring. The village will put itself in motion. This will happen tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until spring comes and changes the work without changing the structure of the days, until summer comes and changes the temperature without changing the weight of what is owed, until the autumn harvest comes, and for a few weeks the stores are full and the ale is fresh, and the whole village collectively exhales before winter comes again. This is the life that the history books skip over to get to the interesting parts. But here is what I want you to take away from today. These people were not simple. They were not passive. They were not simply victims of a system that ground them down, though the system did grind, and it did bear hard on people who had no good options for changing it. They were complex human beings managing complex lives with intelligence and humor and grief and faith, and the particular competence of people who have learned to do difficult things so well that the difficulty becomes invisible. They govern themselves in the spaces the manorial system left them. They built community in the alehouse and the churchyard and the long evenings around the fire. They loved their children and mourned them when they died and had more children. They planted their strips every spring with the faith, not metaphorical but literal and practical, that the ground would produce what they needed. They kept the fire. That's what I keep coming back to. All of them. The Viking farmer, the castle's night watch, the peasant woman counting her stores in January. All of them tending the same thing in different centuries and different languages and different theologies against the same darkness, the fire, the stores, the children, the mourning.